The black man's wrists were bound by cold metal handcuffs faced with public humiliation. People like you don't belong in the executive lounge anyway. Officer Reynolds sneered, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. His badge gleamed under the bright train station lights as he tightened the handcuffs one notch further than necessary. Marcus Johnson, a Harvard-educated engineer, philanthropist, and clean energy innovator, looked directly into Officer Reynolds' eyes without a hint of fear. All around him, airport travelers stopped to stare, many raising their phones to record what was unfolding. Reynolds tightened the handcuffs one notch beyond necessary. A small petty cruelty meant to assert dominance, to inflict discomfort without leaving evidence. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice steady and clear, "you're making a mistake you'll regret very soon." Reynolds laughed, thinking he was just another cop with a power trip. This was another black man he thought he could intimidate, but he had no idea who he really was. He couldn't have known that the man he was treating like a criminal was more than just a regular traveler. He couldn't have known that his career was about to implode, all because he chose the wrong passenger to insult, the wrong man to handcuff, and the wrong day to let his prejudice overrule his judgment. But now he was about to find out. Before we dive into the story, if you believe everyone should be treated with fairness and respect, regardless of race, like and click on the subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from in the comments, because what happens next in this story will leave you speechless. Before he was standing handcuffed in Chicago's Central Station Terminal, Marcus Johnson was simply going about his morning routine. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he had overcome. That crisp winter morning in his elegant but understated apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, Marcus prepared for his environmental summit in Denver. The sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows as he carefully packed prototype solar panels into his carry-on. These were revolutionary designs that could triple energy efficiency in low-income housing. He carried technical specifications that would allow manufacturing plants in rural communities to begin production, and specialized equipment that smaller research labs desperately needed but couldn't afford. He was on a mission to democratize clean energy. As he finished packing, his phone rang with the special ringtone he designed for Sophia, his wife. The screen lit up with a photo of them together in Kenya last year at the opening of their first solar-powered school. 12 years of marriage, and she still looked at him the same way she did when they were graduate students with nothing but dreams and determination. Sophia Johnson, the same woman who had started as a ticket agent at Chicago Central Station at age 19, working grueling shifts while putting herself through night school. The same Sophia who had mortgaged everything they owned to launch what would become Velocity Rail, identifying underserved routes to small cities, gradually building a regional carrier into the country's third-largest rail network with over 200 trains and 0 employees. "All set for your trip?" Sophia asked, her voice carrying the fatigue of her early morning meetings. "Just about," Marcus replied, smiling at the sound of her. "The prototype panels are all packed. This demonstration should help hundreds of families in the Denver area. The housing director says they've been without affordable heating for almost a month. I wish I could join you this time," Sophia said with genuine regret. The board meeting couldn't be rescheduled, and the Seattle route expansion needs final approval. Someone has to keep the trains running. Marcus laughed, no resentment in his voice. "Besides, you'll be there for the community center opening next month. That's the more joyful occasion anyway. I've arranged for David to meet you at the station," Sophia added, referring to Velocity's Chicago operations manager. "He'll make sure the prototypes transfer smoothly to the Denver Express." "You don't have to do that," Marcus said, though he appreciated her thoughtfulness. I can handle a connection like everyone else." "I know you can," Sophia replied, "but I don't want you to experience any delay at all. Besides, David insisted when he heard you were coming through." This was the reality of being married to Sophia Johnson. While Marcus preferred to travel without special treatment, word inevitably spread among Velocity's employees. They were the only ones who knew him as the billionaire's husband and treated him with particular care. Marcus had never been one to flaunt his status or connections. Despite being married to a transportation CEO, he often traveled coach, sometimes even standing in crowded cars. He believed in experiencing the world as others did, in understanding the systems he hoped to improve. Today, though, he had an executive lounge pass, a rare concession to the long cross-country journey ahead and the important work awaiting his arrival. The car Sophia had arranged, not a limousine but a modest hybrid with a trusted driver they'd known for years, arrived promptly. Marcus double-checked his identification and technical documentation, tucked his foundation credentials into his messenger bag, and took a deep breath, centering himself for the journey ahead. As the car approached the busy central terminal, sunlight glinting off the historic glass and steel structure, Marcus felt the familiar mix of excitement and anxiety that preceded every environmental summit. The lives that would be changed, the challenging negotiations ahead, the purpose that drove him forward. What he couldn't have known was that his greatest challenge wouldn't be in a conference room in Denver. It would be right here in Chicago's Central Station at the hands of an officer who would take one look at him and see not a billionaire's husband or innovator, but simply a black man he believed didn't belong in the executive lounge. Have you ever been judged based on the color of your skin rather than who you really are? Share your thoughts in the comments and click on the subscribe button to enjoy this story more. The moment Marcus Johnson stepped into the vast central terminal, the subtle shift began at the Velocity Rail information desk. Marcus presented his ID and confirmation for his executive lounge access, connecting to the Denver Express. The agent glanced at him, then back at the computer screen, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "Executive lounge access?" he questioned, emphasizing the words as if they were an unlikely combination. "Are you certain about that booking?" Marcus had encountered this before, the subtle implication that the well-dressed black man standing before them couldn't possibly have legitimately purchased premium access. "Yes, I'm certain," he responded calmly, sliding his confirmation across the counter. "It's linked to my Denver Express ticket." The agent's fingers tapped across the keyboard, his expression still skeptical. "And how will you be paying for any additional services or upgrades?" "I won't have any extras," Marcus replied. "Everything is included in my current booking." Another passenger, a white businessman in a rumpled suit, approached the adjacent counter. The same agent's colleague greeted him warmly. "Good morning, sir. Traveling to New York today? Let's get you checked in quickly so you can relax before your journey." No questions about his ticket class. No implication that he didn't belong. After finally receiving his access pass, Marcus made his way toward security. That's when he first noticed him, Officer James Reynolds, 45. He carried himself with the swagger of someone who enjoyed the power his uniform provided. Reynolds stood at the entrance to the security lanes, directing passengers. A white family with small children express lane right this way. A group of business travelers priority screening to your left. An elderly Asian couple looking confused, his voice rising with impatience. Regular screening that way. Marcus observed as Reynolds directed every white passenger with a priority boarding pass to the expedited screening lane. When a Latino man in a business suit presented his executive access pass, Reynolds scrutinized it carefully before reluctantly waving him through. With his executive access and priority screening, Marcus approached the expedited lane. Reynolds immediately stepped into his path. "Regular screening is that way, sir," he said firmly, pointing toward the longer line where the wait appeared to be at least 30 minutes. "I have priority access," Marcus replied politely, showing his pass. "Executive class." Reynolds didn't even glance at the document. "We need to verify that. Please step aside." "Verify what exactly?" Marcus asked, his voice still composed but firm. "My pass clearly shows priority access." "Sir, I decide who needs verification. That's my job. Step aside, or you'll be delaying other passengers." Marcus stood his ground, noticing that a small crowd was beginning to observe. "I've noticed that you've allowed every other passenger with priority access through without verification. I'm simply requesting equal treatment." Reynolds' face hardened. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm making an observation," Marcus replied calmly. A white man in his 50s with a supervisor badge approached. Thomas Wilson, the terminal operations supervisor, alerted by another officer about the potential situation, asked, "Is there a problem here?" His eyes darted between Reynolds and Marcus. "I'd like to report what appears to be discriminatory treatment," Marcus said. "I've been denied access to the priority lane despite having an executive pass, while others with identical documentation have been allowed through without question." Wilson barely looked at Marcus's pass. "Officer Reynolds is following security protocols. Some passengers are selected for additional verification based on security algorithms." "And what algorithms would those be?" Marcus asked. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not at liberty to discuss security procedures, but I can assure you it's random selection." "Random?" Marcus replied, his eyebrow raised slightly. "I've been observing for 10 minutes, and the pattern doesn't appear random at all." "Sir, questioning security procedures can itself be flagged as suspicious behavior," Wilson said, his tone carrying a warning. Reynolds seemed pleased by the supervisor's tacit support. "You've been selected for additional screening. Step this way." As Marcus was led to a separate area, he noticed other travelers watching some with sympathy, others averting their eyes, the universal response of those who witness injustice but prefer not to get involved. The additional screening area was set apart, visible to other travelers, the humiliation public by design. Reynolds snapped on blue latex gloves with deliberate slowness. "Open your carry-on," he ordered. As Marcus complied, he began removing items one by one, examining each with exaggerated scrutiny. When he reached the solar panel prototypes, his eyebrows raised. "That's a lot of technical equipment," he commented. "What are these for?" "They're prototypes for a clean energy summit in Denver," Marcus explained. "I have all the proper documentation and transportation permits." Reynolds barely glanced at the papers he offered. "Seems like a lot of trouble to go through. Most people just enjoy their business trips without all this baggage." "It's not a business trip," Marcus corrected him. "It's an environmental summit for low-income housing solutions." Reynolds smirked as he continued his search. "Environmental summit with executive lounge access? That seems wasteful." The comment was designed to sting, to imply that Marcus's presence in the executive area was somehow fraudulent or inappropriate. "My travel arrangements aren't relevant to security screening," Marcus replied, his patience being tested, but his composure intact. Reynolds continued his invasive search, now examining his personal items with inappropriate thoroughness. Designer messenger bag, executive access, environmental work, interesting combination, he said, holding up his pass, examining it again with theatrical suspicion. "These executive passes cost hundreds. Interesting career and what did you call it? Clean energy." The implication was clear. He didn't believe someone like Marcus could legitimately afford such access. The comment lingered in the air, heard by nearby passengers and other officers. Marcus took a deep breath, centering himself before responding. "Officer Reynolds," he said, noting his name badge for the first time. "I understand you have a job to do, but your comments about my appearance, my access level, and my profession are inappropriate and irrelevant to security procedures." Reynolds' face flushed with anger at being directly challenged. "I decide what's relevant to security, sir," he said, his voice hardening. "And right now, your attitude is becoming a concern." It was the moment the professional tension transformed into something personal. The moment Officer Reynolds decided that this well-spoken black man needed to be taught a lesson about questioning his authority. Reynolds continued his inspection of Marcus's carry-on with deliberate slowness, stretching what should have been a 5-minute procedure into an ordeal approaching 20 minutes. Each item was removed, examined, and set aside with theatrical suspicion. The solar prototypes, clearly labeled and professionally packaged, received particular scrutiny. "What exactly are these?" Reynolds demanded, holding up one of the panels. "As I've explained twice now, those are high-efficiency solar prototypes for the Denver summit," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite his growing frustration. "The documentation is right there in the clear folder." Reynolds barely glanced at the paperwork. "Pretty expensive equipment. Who's paying for all this?" "The Johnson Foundation," Marcus answered. "We partner with manufacturing companies for development." "We?" Reynolds questioned with a smirk. "So you work for this foundation?" "I'm the co-founder and executive director," Marcus clarified. Reynolds let out a dismissive chuckle. "Executive director with executive lounge access to deliver solar panels? Seems like those donations could go further if you traveled coach, or is that beneath you?" The comment hung in the air, the first openly disparaging remark designed to humiliate rather than investigate. Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the comment for what it was. "My travel arrangements are irrelevant to security screening," Marcus stated firmly. "I'd appreciate it if you would focus on legitimate security concerns rather than making judgments about my travel class." Reynolds' expression hardened at being directly challenged. He moved closer, intentionally invading Marcus's personal space. "You know what I've noticed in 15 years doing this job?" he said, voice lowered but still audible to those nearby. "Executive access is usually for people who earned it, not people like you." The words landed like a physical blow. There it was, the naked prejudice behind the random screening, not about security at all, but about a black man in a space where Officer Reynolds believed he didn't belong. A collective intake of breath from observers confirmed the line had been crossed. Even in 2025, such blatant discrimination was shocking when witnessed in broad daylight. Marcus's composure wavered for just a moment before he gathered himself. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor immediately," he stated, his voice clear and unwavering. "My supervisor is busy," Reynolds replied dismissively. "Then I'd like to speak to their supervisor," Marcus persisted. "Your comment was inappropriate and discriminatory." Reynolds' face flushed with anger. "You're becoming disruptive, sir. Interfering with security procedures is a federal offense." The threat was clear. Comply and accept the humiliation or face escalating consequences. Marcus looked directly at Reynolds, measuring his response carefully. "I understand security procedures, Officer Reynolds. I also understand my rights as a traveler. Your personal comments about my appearance and assumptions about my economic status are not part of legitimate security protocols." "You don't belong here," he shouted. "You people always think you know your rights," Reynolds said, abandoning all pretense of professional conduct. "Always ready to play the race card when you're just being asked to follow the same rules as everyone else." "You people," Marcus repeated, the phrase hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. Reynolds realized his mistake too late. The mask had slipped completely. Now, rather than backtrack, he doubled down. "You heard me," he said, voice rising. "Entitled people who don't know their place, making everything about race when it's about attitude. Your attitude is the problem here." Thomas Wilson, the supervisor who had earlier dismissed Marcus's concerns, stood at the periphery, clearly aware of the escalating situation, but making no move to intervene. Marcus spotted him and called out, "Mr. Wilson, I need to speak with you about Officer Reynolds' conduct." Wilson pretended not to hear, turning away to speak with another employee. Reynolds, emboldened by his supervisor's tacit approval, stepped closer to Marcus. "You know what happens to difficult passengers," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "They miss their trains. Security concerns can take hours to resolve, sometimes days. Sometimes they end up on no-travel lists." It was no longer about security. It was about punishment for questioning authority, for refusing to accept humiliation quietly. "Are you threatening to prevent me from boarding my train because I questioned your discriminatory treatment?" Marcus asked, each word precise and measured. Reynolds smiled, a cold expression devoid of humor. "I'm explaining the consequences of continued non-compliance and disruptive behavior." With calculated deliberation, he began repacking Marcus's belongings, mixing items together and disorganizing the carefully arranged solar prototypes. "Oops," he said with false concern as he accidentally knocked over a container of specialized components. "Security can be messy sometimes." It was the pettiest form of power, the ability to create inconvenience without consequence, to punish through 1,000 small humiliations. For Marcus, it was the moment of decision. He had endured the discriminatory treatment, the inappropriate comments, the disregard for his rights, all while maintaining his composure. But watching the prototypes being deliberately mishandled crossed the line. Those weren't just his possessions. They represented life-changing technology for vulnerable communities. "I need those prototypes to remain organized and intact," he said firmly. "They're properly labeled for presentation at the summit." "Should have thought about that before you decided to be difficult," Reynolds replied. "Maybe next time you'll show proper respect for the process." The public humiliation was reaching its crescendo. Reynolds' voice had gradually increased in volume, ensuring that everyone nearby could witness Marcus's treatment. It was a display of dominance, the officer putting the black man in his place. Several passengers looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. A few continued recording, documenting the abuse of power unfolding before them. Then Reynolds made his fatal miscalculation. "In fact," he said, hand moving to his handcuffs, "your increasingly agitated behavior is concerning me. You're exhibiting signs of potential threat." "I'm standing perfectly still and speaking calmly," Marcus pointed out. "How exactly am I threatening you?" Reynolds' expression darkened. "That tone, those questions, the way you're standing in my professional assessment, you're becoming aggressive." The fabrication was transparent, creating a narrative of threat where none existed, laying groundwork for escalation from harassment to arrest. "Are you seriously suggesting that asking questions about discriminatory treatment constitutes aggression?" Marcus asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "There you go again, questioning my authority," Reynolds said, unclipping his handcuffs. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The moment crystallized with perfect clarity. Reynolds had crossed the line from harassment to false arrest, from discrimination to abusive power. There was no security concern, no legitimate reason for detention, just a man with a badge punishing a black man who refused to accept mistreatment quietly. Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their authority simply because they could? Tell us the story in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button now to see what happens when Officer Reynolds discovers exactly who he's been insulting and how his attempt to humiliate Marcus Johnson will become the biggest mistake of his career. Marcus had made a decision. Reaching slowly into his messenger bag, he removed his phone. "Before you place me under arrest on fabricated charges, I'd like to make one phone call," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "You can call whoever you want from detention," Reynolds replied, roughly grabbing his wrists and applying the handcuffs with unnecessary force. The metal bit into his skin, the discomfort evident in the slight tightening around his eyes. It was the kind of technique passed down through generations of officers who understood how to punish while staying just within the boundaries of what could be defended later. "See where your attitude got you?" Reynolds taunted, loud enough for nearby travelers to hear. "Now you'll miss your fancy express train. Maybe next time you'll show proper respect to station security." As he spoke, he made a show of roughly gathering Marcus's scattered belongings, carelessly shoving the solar prototypes into his bag with deliberate disregard for their organization or fragility. The message was clear. His mission, his purpose, his dignity were all irrelevant in the face of his authority. "Those prototypes are for low-income families," Marcus stated calmly, watching as months of careful engineering and testing were undone in moments of spiteful disregard. "You should have thought about those poor families before you decided to be difficult," Reynolds replied with a smirk. "Actions have consequences, sir." By now, at least 20 passengers had formed a loose circle around the scene, many openly recording with their phones. The videos captured what Reynolds seemed oblivious to: the stark contrast between Marcus's dignified calm and his increasingly aggressive behavior. The footage showed no signs of the disorderly conduct he had claimed, no evidence of obstruction or threat, just a man standing perfectly still while being handcuffed and taunted. "This is wrong. He didn't do anything," called out one passenger, a middle-aged woman clutching her ticket. "Mind your own business unless you want to join him," Reynolds snapped back, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon, a threatening gesture caught on multiple cameras. Among the gathering crowd stood Michael Chen, a 24-year-old customer service representative for Velocity Rail. Unlike the other station employees who looked away or pretended not to notice, Michael stepped forward, Velocity ID badge prominently displayed. "Officer Reynolds," Michael said, voice shaking slightly but determined. "I've been observing this entire interaction as part of my customer service duties. Mr. Johnson has remained calm and cooperative throughout. This appears to be a violation of both station security protocols and Velocity's passenger rights policies." Reynolds turned to Michael, eyes narrowing dangerously. "Get back to your counter before you lose your job, kid. This is official police business, not customer service. I'm required to report any potential passenger rights violations." Michael persisted, standing his ground despite visible nervousness. "And my supervisor would want to know about this situation immediately." "Your supervisor can take it up with me later," Reynolds said dismissively. "Right now, you're interfering with an arrest. Last warning, back off or you're next." The threat hung in the air, naked intimidation of a witness attempting to intervene. Michael hesitated, courage warring with self-preservation. Marcus, still handcuffed but remarkably composed, caught Michael's eye. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Thank you for speaking up, but please don't risk your position. This will be resolved soon." Michael stepped back reluctantly but remained nearby, continuing to observe and document the situation. Reynolds grabbed Marcus's arm to lead him away, his grip unnecessarily tight, another small cruelty designed to demonstrate control without leaving marks. But, as he moved to lead Marcus away, something unusual began happening around them. The station's atmosphere shifted subtly at first. Then, with increasing momentum, A call came through on Thomas Wilson's radio. He listened, his face draining of color. A moment later, his phone rang. He answered, listening intently before his eyes widened in shock. "Yes, ma'am. Immediately, ma'am. I understand the severity. Yes, I'll handle it personally." Across the terminal, other supervisors were receiving similar calls. Security personnel spoke urgently into their radios. Customer service managers huddled in concerned groups, glancing repeatedly toward the confrontation. Even Reynolds, focused as he was on Marcus, began to sense that something unusual was happening. Station employees were moving with increased urgency. Radios crackled with coded communications. Managers appeared from offices, their expressions grave. Thomas Wilson approached, his earlier dismissive attitude replaced by barely concealed panic. "Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice tight with anxiety, "I need to speak with you immediately." "Not now, Thomas," Reynolds replied impatiently. "I'm in the middle of an arrest." "James, this is serious," Wilson insisted, using his first name for the first time. "You need to pause this procedure immediately." "Back off," Reynolds snapped. "I know what I'm doing." Wilson's phone rang again. He answered, his hand visibly trembling. "Yes, ma'am. He's still proceeding. Yes, I understand he's refusing toys, ma'am. Immediately." He turned back to Reynolds, genuine fear now evident in his expression. "James, release him now. This is coming from the highest level." Reynolds scoffed, his ego still blinding him to the shifting dynamics. "The highest level? What did the station director call you?" "I don't answer to administrative staff, Thomas. I answer to the police department." "James, please," Wilson pleaded, now desperate. "You don't understand what's happening. Just trust me and remove those handcuffs." The commotion had attracted the attention of Captain Harris, Reynolds' direct supervisor, who approached rapidly from across the terminal. His face was a mask of professional concern, hiding unmistakable alarm. "Reynolds," he called out sharply, "stand down immediately." Reynolds turned, confusion finally breaking through his arrogance. Captain Harris rarely appeared in the terminal unless something significant had occurred. "Captain, I'm handling a disruptive passenger." "Remove those handcuffs now," Harris interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "That's a direct order." "But sir, I've already initiated the arrest process. He was interfering with security procedures and—" "Now, Reynolds." Captain Harris's voice carried an urgency Reynolds had never heard before. "Pray to God it's not too late." Bewildered but compliant, Reynolds produced the key and removed the handcuffs from Marcus's wrists. He rubbed them gently, the only acknowledgement of the discomfort he had endured. Captain Harris turned to Marcus, his demeanor transformed to one of profound professional respect. "Mr. Johnson, I extend my deepest apologies for this incident. Your wife is arriving now." Reynolds looked between them in growing confusion. His wife? Who the hell is his wife? The captain's expression was a mixture of disbelief and dread. "You didn't check his ID thoroughly, did you? You didn't recognize the name Johnson?" "Johnson is a common name," Reynolds replied defensively. "What does his wife have to do with anything?" Before the captain could answer, a commotion near the terminal entrance drew everyone's attention. Station security staff were creating a path through the crowded terminal. The station director himself had appeared, straightening his tie nervously. Reynolds watched in growing apprehension as the crowd parted. Something was very wrong. The confident certainty that had fueled his actions minutes ago began to crumble, replaced by the first tendrils of genuine fear. "Captain," he asked, voice lowered, "who exactly is his wife?" Captain Harris looked at Reynolds with a mixture of pity and anger. "Sophia Johnson," he said simply, as if the name alone should explain everything. Reynolds shook his head, still not comprehending. "Am I supposed to know who that is?" The captain gestured toward the windows overlooking the rail yard, where dozens of trains bore the distinctive Velocity Rail logo. Beyond them stood the corporate headquarters building, the name Johnson visible even at this distance. "Sophia Johnson," the captain repeated slowly. "Founder and CEO of Velocity Rail, the company that employs half the people in this terminal, the woman who sits on the Transportation Authority Board, the rail owner whose name is on your daughter's college scholarship program." As understanding finally dawned on Reynolds's face, the captain leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "You just handcuffed, insulted, and attempted to falsely arrest the husband of the most powerful woman in this station, and the cameras caught every second of it." Reynolds' face drained of color as the full implications hit him. The swagger, the arrogance, the certainty vanished in an instant, replaced by the sickening realization of what he had done and who he had done it to. It wasn't just a career-ending mistake. It was a life-altering miscalculation that would strip away everything he had built over 15 years, his authority, his reputation, his financial security, all because he couldn't resist the urge to put a black man in his place. And as Sophia Johnson entered the terminal, flanked by rail executives and legal counsel, Officer James Reynolds finally understood the true meaning of consequences. The atmosphere in Central Terminal shifted palpably as Sophia Johnson entered. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove, the bearing of a woman who had risen from ticket agent to rail CEO through sheer determination and vision. She wasn't a physically imposing woman, but her presence commanded attention, radiating an authority that needed no badge or uniform to enforce. Behind her walked 4 people in impeccable suits, Velocity's chief legal counsel and executive team. Their expressions were professionally neutral, but their purposeful stride matched their CEO's resolute pace. Station Director Robert Chen, who minutes earlier had been in a budget meeting, now rushed across the terminal, perspiration visible on his forehead despite the building's careful climate control. "Ms. Johnson," Chen called out, slightly breathless, "I've just been informed of the situation. I want to assure you we're taking this extremely seriously." Sophia barely acknowledged Chen, her eyes scanning the terminal until she located Marcus. The subtle tightening of her jaw was the only indication of the controlled fury she felt seeing the marks on her husband's wrists where the handcuffs had been. As Sophia approached, Officer Reynolds stood frozen, the color drained from his face. The dawning horror of his situation was written in his eyes, the gradual sickening realization that 15 years of unchecked power had led him to this catastrophic miscalculation. Thomas Wilson hovered nearby, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by desperate damage control. "Ms. Johnson, I want to personally apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding. We have the highest respect for Mr. Johnson and the Foundation's work." "I didn't know who Mr. Johnson was," Reynolds interjected, his voice barely audible. "If I had known—" "If you had known it was my husband," Sophia interrupted, her voice measured but carrying an undercurrent of steel, "would that have changed how you responded?" "Because that's precisely the problem, isn't it? The selective application of respect based on perceived status." Wilson fell silent, unable to counter the truth in her words. Sophia reached Marcus, gently taking his hands and examining the red marks on his wrists. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice softening for the first time. "I'm fine," he assured her, his composure still remarkable despite what he'd endured. "Just concerned about the prototypes." Officer Reynolds was less than careful with them. For those watching, it might have seemed an odd priority to worry about solar panels rather than his own treatment. but it spoke volumes about Marcus's character and the mission that had brought him to the station in the first place. Sophia turned to face Reynolds, who seemed to physically shrink under her gaze. "You're Officer Reynolds?" Sophia asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes, ma'am," Reynolds managed, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. "You just attempted to arrest my husband on fabricated charges." Reynolds swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I'm really sorry. It was a mistake and misunderstanding. There was a security protocol that—" "What security protocol involves telling a passenger that people like him don't belong in the executive lounge?" Sophia interrupted, her voice dangerously quiet. "What protocol involves handcuffing a calm, cooperative traveler for questioning discriminatory treatment?" Reynolds had no answer. The true magnitude of the situation was beginning to ripple through the terminal. Longtime station employees recognized Sophia Johnson and now understood the stunning twist of fate. The husband of the woman Officer Reynolds had chosen to humiliate. For those unfamiliar with the Johnson story, it seemed like a scene from a movie, the powerful CEO rushing to defend her wronged husband. But the reality was even more remarkable. Sophia and Marcus had met in graduate school. She worked nights as a ticket agent to pay tuition while he was on an academic scholarship, but took jobs at the engineering lab and cafeteria to cover living expenses. Both from different backgrounds, both driven by dreams bigger than their circumstances. While Marcus excelled in environmental engineering, Sophia worked her way up from ticket agent to operations, learning every aspect of the rail business from the ground up. When she identified underserved regional routes that major carriers ignored, she mortgaged everything they owned to lease a single train. Velocity Rail began with that one train and 8 employees, including Sophia, as both CEO and occasional conductor. Marcus continued his engineering work but devoted evenings and weekends to helping build the fledgling rail company, designing more efficient systems, negotiating equipment rights, and establishing the technical framework that would support their growth. Over 12 years, through recessions, fuel crises, and industry consolidation, Velocity expanded methodically. Sophia's operational expertise and Marcus's technical acumen proved a formidable combination. When larger carriers failed or contracted, Velocity acquired their routes, their trains, and sometimes their entire regional operations. Unlike many companies that grew through cutthroat tactics, Velocity built a reputation for treating employees fairly. The ticket agent turned CEO never forgot where she came from. When other rail companies slashed benefits, Velocity protected them. When competitors outsourced jobs, Velocity kept them in-house, building loyalty that translated to customer service. The Johnson Foundation grew alongside the rail company, initially funding scholarships for employees' children, later expanding to environmental innovation work. Marcus eventually left his engineering firm to lead the foundation full-time, bringing the same strategic thinking to philanthropy that had helped build the rail company. Now that same couple stood in Central Terminal, Marcus with the marks of handcuffs still visible on his wrists, Sophia facing the officer responsible with controlled fury. "Here's what happens next," Sophia stated, her tone making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "We'll review the security footage from the entire incident. We'll take statements from witnesses. We'll examine Officer Reynolds' record for previous complaints of discriminatory behavior." Velocity's chief legal counsel stepped forward, tablet in hand. "We've already accessed the security feed, Miss Johnson. The footage clearly shows Officer Reynolds allowing white passengers with priority access through expedited screening while diverting passengers of color for verification. It also shows Mr. Prive Johnson remaining completely calm throughout the interaction, contradicting any claim of disorderly conduct. Captain Harris, Reynolds' supervisor, looked increasingly grim. "We'll conduct a full internal investigation, Ms. Johnson. Officer Reynolds is suspended effective immediately pending the outcome." "An internal investigation isn't sufficient," Sophia replied. "This goes beyond one incident or one officer. This is about systemic practices that have apparently been tolerated for years." Station Director Chen inserted himself into the conversation, desperate to contain the situation. "Ms. Johnson, I assure you we take these allegations extremely seriously. Perhaps we could discuss this privately in my office?" "There's nothing to discuss privately," Sophia responded. "My husband was publicly humiliated. Any resolution will be equally public." Officer Reynolds stood alone, his world collapsing around him. 15 years of unchecked authority, of small cruelties justified as security procedures, of complaints dismissed and behavior excused, all undone in 30 minutes because he chose the wrong passenger to target. His face registered the full realization of what awaited him: suspension, investigation, possibly criminal charges for false arrest, certainly civil rights violation complaints. The professional consequences were devastating enough, but the public humiliation might be worse, to be forever known as the officer who handcuffed a rail owner's husband out of pure prejudice. "You're fired immediately," Sophia stated boldly, turning to Reynolds, who was shaking, already with tears rolling down his cheeks. "How will my daughter finish college if I have no job?" he muttered to himself. At this point, his tears were flowing freely, and he couldn't help but beg for his job. Marcus looked at him with compassion and turned to his wife for mercy for a suspension rather than firing him. Marcus, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "If I may," he said, his voice drawing everyone's attention, "I'd like to address what happened today, not just as an individual incident, but as a symptom of a larger problem." All eyes turned to him. The man who minutes earlier had been handcuffed and threatened with arrest, now commanding the space with quiet authority. "What happened to me today happens to black travelers every day," he continued. "The difference is most don't have the resources or connections to fight back. Most suffer these indignities in silence, missing connections, losing money, enduring humiliation because the system is designed to leave them powerless." "What exactly are you proposing?" Captain Harris asked cautiously. "Immediate implementation of body cameras for all security personnel," Marcus answered without hesitation. "Mandatory anti-bias training conducted by independent experts, not internal departments. A transparent complaint process that doesn't automatically favor officers over civilians, and consequences for supervisors who enable discriminatory behavior." He eyed Thomas Wilson meaningfully, who looked away. "These aren't controversial requests," Marcus continued. "They're basic protections to ensure that power is exercised fairly." Sophia nodded in agreement. Velocity Rail carries 45% of this station's passenger traffic. If these changes aren't implemented, we are prepared to reconsider our hub operations here. The implications of such a move were staggering, essentially catastrophic for the station's finances and the regional economy. It wasn't an idle threat, and everyone present knew it. Station Director Chen paled visibly. "We can begin implementing these measures immediately, Ms. Johnson. I'll convene an emergency meeting of station security leadership this afternoon." As the leadership group moved toward the director's office to formalize the agreements, Sophia noticed Michael Chen, the young employee who had tried to intervene on Marcus's behalf. "You're the staff member who spoke up?" she asked. Michael nodded nervously. "Yes, ma'am. Michael Chen, Customer Service Representative." "Thank you for having the courage to do the right thing despite the risk," Sophia said, genuine appreciation in her voice. "That's the kind of integrity Velocity values." Michael straightened, a smile breaking through the anxiety. Thank you, ma'am. All because he couldn't resist the urge to put a black man in his place, only to discover too late that his place was far higher than he could have imagined. 6 months later, the central terminal looked different. Body cameras were standard equipment for all security personnel. Signs in multiple languages informed travelers of their rights and the procedure for filing complaints. Security staff reflected the diversity of the traveling public they served. Officer James Reynolds was no longer stationed at the checkpoint. After a 3-month suspension, he had been required to complete extensive retraining, including 200 hours of community service with the Johnson Foundation's urban programs. Rather than returning to his previous role, he had requested a transfer to the department's newly formed Community Relations Division, where he now worked to build trust between security personnel and diverse communities. The system-wide changes extended beyond this single station. Sophia Johnson had leveraged Velocity's influence to push for standardized anti-discrimination protocols across all stations where the rail company operated. The Respecting Travel initiative had become a case study in corporate responsibility, using economic leverage to drive social change. Marcus Johnson continued his environmental work but added a new focus, using the Foundation's resources to document and address discrimination in public spaces. The educational materials developed from his experience were now part of training programs for security personnel nationwide. On this particular morning, Marcus once again approached the security checkpoint for his train to Denver, connecting to another environmental summit. The difference in his treatment was immediately apparent: professional, respectful, efficient. As he collected his belongings after screening, he noticed a familiar face, James Reynolds, now dressed in a community relations uniform, speaking with a group of new security officers. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of recognition passing between them. Reynolds hesitated, then approached him cautiously. "Mr. Johnson," he said, the arrogance gone from his voice, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Officer Reynolds," he acknowledged, "though I understand it's not officer anymore." "No," he admitted. "I'm in community relations now. Part of my job is training new staff on respectful engagement practices." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "How's that going for you?" Marcus asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Reynolds considered the question carefully. "It's enlightening. I've learned more in 6 months than in 15 years with a badge." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "Mr. Johnson, I never properly apologized for what happened, not just for the arrest attempt, but for how I spoke to you, how I treated you. It was wrong on every level." Marcus studied him, noting the changes 6 months had wrought, the humble demeanor, the absence of the swagger that had defined him before. "Thank you for acknowledging that," he said finally. "It matters." "The Foundation's training program next week on implicit bias in public spaces I've signed up to attend," Reynolds said hesitantly. Marcus nodded. "I'll be leading part of that session. I look forward to your participation." As he walked away toward his platform, he passed the customer service desk where Michael Chen, now wearing a supervisor's badge, greeted him warmly. "Mr. Johnson, good to see you again. Your usual executive lounge access is ready, and Miss Johnson called to say she'll meet you in Denver this time." "Thank you, Michael," Marcus replied with a genuine smile. "How's the new position working out?" "Wonderful," Michael beamed. "The promotion came with tuition assistance. I'm starting night classes for my engineering degree next month." "Excellent," Marcus approved. "The Foundation always needs good engineers. Keep in touch." As Marcus boarded his train, settling into his executive seat without anyone questioning his presence there, he reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. One humiliating encounter had transformed not just station security procedures, but sparked a national conversation about power, prejudice, and the selective application of respect. The system hadn't changed because of his status or his wife's influence alone. It had changed because they had used that influence strategically, demanding reforms that benefited everyone, not just those with connections or resources. As the train pulled away from the station, Marcus looked out at the terminal building, now emblazoned with Velocity's new slogan, "Everyone deserves first-class respect." The officer had learned that lesson the hard way, but thousands of travelers would benefit from the changes his mistake had set in motion. But the story doesn't end there. As Marcus's train sped toward Denver, a more complex narrative was unfolding behind the scene zone that would challenge everything he thought he knew about that day at the station. In a small office at the Department of Transportation's Intelligence Division, Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez reviewed the footage from Central Terminal for the dozenth time. Something about the incident had never sat right with her, and now she was beginning to understand why. "Play it again," she instructed her analyst. "Focus on the woman in the gray coat at timestamp 14:22. The screen showed a nondescript middle-aged woman observing Marcus's confrontation with Officer Reynolds, her phone raised as if recording. But Rodriguez had noticed something others missed. The woman wasn't actually filming. She was communicating. "Enhance and run facial recognition," Rodriguez ordered. The computer worked for several seconds before displaying a match. Victoria Zhang, known associate of Ecoterror, a radical environmental group that had targeted energy companies with increasingly sophisticated attacks. "Now track her movements before the incident," Rodriguez said. The footage showed Zhang arriving at the station 30 minutes before Marcus, positioning herself near security, making a call just before Officer Reynolds approached Marcus. "Son of a bitch," Rodriguez muttered. It was staged. Not Marcus's reaction that had been genuine, but the confrontation itself had been engineered. Someone had tipped off Officer Reynolds, knowing his history of discriminatory behavior, knowing Marcus would be traveling that day, knowing Sophia Johnson's influence would create a perfect storm. But why? Rodriguez pulled up the Denver Summit schedule. Marcus Johnson was scheduled to present revolutionary solar technology that could make clean energy affordable for low-income communities, nationwide technology that would threaten billions in fossil fuel profits. "Get me everything on the Johnson Foundation's Denver presentation," Rodriguez instructed. "And put a protection detail on Marcus Johnson immediately. This isn't over." As Marcus's train crossed state lines, he remained unaware that his humiliation had been merely the opening move in a dangerous gamione where he was both pawn and target. The real question wasn't who had orchestrated his public humiliation, but what they planned to do next, and whether Sophia Johnson's influence would be enough to protect him when he arrived in Denver. Because sometimes, privilege isn't just about who you are. It's about who wants to take you down.